Well, thank you. Good afternoon, folks. Glad you could join us after our lunchtime switch. This session is about fragments. Now, I'm going to do an introduction to fragments first because some of you may or may not know about them yet, but they're a great way of extending authoring. So let me come in here. So we're going to talk about what fragments are, and then I'm going to go through. Most of the session will be on a demonstration on using them. So we'll talk about managing fragments, importing fragments. Importing a fragment is the phrase we use when we actually want to use a fragment to generate elements in the management pack. Using the browsers that the fragments provide when we're importing them. We're also going to talk about creating your own fragments, and that includes forklifting, which was, somebody gave a little heads up on that phrase. We'll talk about that more. And then quickly a bit about editing fragments and adding to a fragment so that you can make more complex fragments. All of that probably doesn't mean anything unless you know what a fragment is. So a fragment is another way to create, the discoveries, rules, etc. Most things that can go into a management pack can be in a fragment. And let me just shuffle something over so I can see my notes on one monitor by putting the GoToMeeting stuff on another monitor. Okay. There's a list, but just off the top of my head here, monitors, rules, discoveries, overrides, tasks, diagnostics, recoveries, views, and folders and string resources can all go into fragments. And if it turned out that there was something else you needed, we could probably add it. We'd have to look at that. So we have been allowed by Kevin Holman to host some of his fragments or all of his fragments on GitHub, along with some fragments that we created, not too many yet. And we want to encourage a community to submit fragments that we would also post up there. We haven't actually done much on that yet, but that is something that's coming. So within our products, there's a single button click to download and get the latest and update fragments from GitHub. So a fragment is just a piece of XML. Now, Kevin Holman didn't originate the concept, but he popularized it. And basically, we'll take a look at them. It's just a piece of code, XML, that looks similar to the management pack itself. If you ever looked at the XML of a management pack, you'll actually recognize most of what's in a fragment. Fragments are currently used, or were currently only used in Visual Studio authoring extensions that you would load a fragment and you do a manual search and replace to replace things. You didn't have browsers, you didn't have some of the smarts we've put in there. And so we worked with Kevin to make sure that we've got excellent support there, and I think he's quite happy with it, so we're very happy with that. When we want to import a fragment, we need values for all the placeholders. And so a placeholder is just a name. It's got a couple of hash signs in front of it, around it, so that we can uniquely find it. And we'll see that a little later. But many of the placeholders have reserved names that bring up a browser. So if you have a name like counter name for a placeholder, we'll bring up a browser that'll bring up the performance counter browser, so you can specify the counter name and instance name, and all three of those, or four parts of that, all in one operation. It greatly simplifies things, and of course by browsing you get all the advantages we've been showing you of almost no typing, which is good when you've got a computer that doesn't have a shift key like Paul does. I'll leave that alone. The other thing we do is we keep track of the previous values of placeholders, so that if you go to import another fragment or the same fragment, it'll already be pre-populated with the values you used last time for all of those parameters. So most of the time you'll only need to change one or two things. For instance, if you needed to create monitors for 5 different services, you'd go import the service fragment. You just simply click on the Browse button for the service name, select the service you want out of the list, and say Import. Do the same thing, choose a different service, and I would imagine, I've never clocked this, but I would imagine I could put in 5 monitors for 5 different services in well under a minute. The advantage here is that the fragments can be quite quick to import because there's very little choices here. There's a small number of parameters that you need to fill in the placeholders, and there's not much else you can change. And you compare that to our wizards, which allow you an awful lot of flexibility. Now, most of the time, the defaults are going to be adequate, and you'll find that a lot of times you can just tab through with next, next, next. But you still have, between 5 and maybe a dozen pages to consider. There's a lot more questions you may want to ask yourself. So by taking away some of that flexibility in a fragment, you gain speed and simplicity in operation. So when we go to use the fragment, import it, we take this fragment template, we replace the placeholders, and then we create the elements. And we'll be demonstrating that in a lot of detail. So I think the next thing is we start with our demonstration. And let me find my come out of boxes thing here. So first thing we'll talk about is managing fragments, because you need to get them. They don't come out of the box because they're going to be updated frequently. So we, under Tools, in both MP Author Professional and MP Studio, have this Manage Fragments menu item, which brings up this Manage Fragments dialog. You'll note it's looking pretty bare right now. Couple things. This is a path we're going to use to store fragments. So it's under your personal documents. Okay. You may want to change that. We have a browse button here to allow you to do that. You might choose to use a common folder amongst a team that could be on a share. But typically we'd leave it like that. So we want to get some fragments, so let's just click this link to download the fragment library from GitHub. And in that time, it downloaded the zip file, unpacked it, loaded all the fragments onto disk, etc., and it should populate the list view here. I said it should. Ian, make a note. Let's just bring that up. It should be populated by now. There we go. Yeah, after we do that download, it was supposed to populate that list, folks. I don't know why it didn't. I know it used to do that. It's something that slipped through and is broken. But this would be what you see the subsequent times. We have a list here of all the fragments that are now known. So they're grouped by name, so you can see what they're going to do typically by name. So class and discovery script PowerShell. Obviously, that's going to create a class using a PowerShell discovery, the sort of thing I was demonstrating earlier today. It may have some differences. It may do a little more than what I did, may do a little less. We'll see. So all of them have usually pretty good names. They're organized in a couple of folders. So there's a Kevin Holman folder. There's a Select folder here, and those are a couple that we've provided. There will be a couple other folders that we will see, and let me I'll just bring that up to demonstrate the folder structure here. So all of Kevin's fragments are stored in a Kevin Holman folder, and those are all read-only. I'll discuss what that means in a second. The Select folders are here in a Select folder. We have a user submissions folder that when we get submissions in from the community, we'll be putting them under here, perhaps in subfolders. I haven't quite decided that. We'll see when they come in the volume. And those would be downloaded from the GitHub website. We also have this folder called My Fragments. And this is where it's our intention that you store all of your fragments there. We would not collide with those. So if you have a fragment in there and we download new fragments from GitHub, we would not touch your fragments in the My Fragments folders. If you were, for example, to come in and modify one of Kevin's fragments, we don't know about that. We might be tempted to stomp over it when we download the next set. So stick with My Fragments, and we'll talk about this a bit more later. We also have a description, and you can hover over the fragment. It'll give you a description which will stay up just long enough that you can't quite read it. Will it, or will it stay up forever? Yeah, it seems to be staying up for a long enough time. But we also have ability to do some searching here. And this, on the left-hand side, this dialog marked as filter here, is where you can specify certain filtering for this. So we can do a full text search. So if we want to look for a word consecutive in here, we can find that this, these two have consecutive in them. So if we're looking for consecutive samples, and obviously from the name here, that's what these do. I probably spelled it wrong. Anyways, we can do full word searches on it, etc. We don't need to do that. We also have the ability to search for monitor types. So if you're looking for recoveries, we can simply check the recovery box and it'll show you the only fragments, or it'll only show you fragments that actually will create a recovery. Now, there are some, just trying to remember which ones, discoveries and views, for instance. There are fragments that have more than one, and so this would be an AND. So in this case, we're looking for a fragment that has both discoveries and views in it. So by selecting more than one, you can filter down fairly easily on the element type you're looking for. We can also look for the parameter names. Remember I was discussing counter name. So these are the fragments that will deal with performance counters because they'll always be using the counter name parameter name so that the browser will work. So there's a very simple way to get at it that way. And there's another thing we're putting in is keywords so that you can find out, for instance, all of the fragments created, authored by Mike Sargent, for instance, and that's this one. Or by Silex Software, and that includes the one that Paul created as well as the one I did. Kevin is going to be updating his fragments to include some of these tags. So far he's only done it on one right now, and as we get an updated version we'll do that. But the idea is that we can put in an arbitrary set of keywords and make it a little easier to find here as well. So there's a bunch of different ways, and just for what it's worth, these are all ANDs. So if you select monitors that include counter names, we will restrict that down so only these performance counter monitor fragments. If we uncheck monitor, you'll see that it also includes the rules. And then if we wanted to, there's not a great example here to include some other stuff, well, we could search for script. Well, that did not do what I expected it to do. I think it did an okay. Yeah, close was highlighted here, sorry. Anyways, we can filter by that. You'll also see this filter dialog in the in a search dialog for importing fragments, and we'll show you that a little bit later. This is helpful just to organize the fragments in the manage dialog, but in the import with the search, you'll actually find it much more useful there. So we have downloaded our fragments, and they're all available. There's a couple other little things I was going to show here. If you select a fragment, you have a choice of editing it, you can rename it, or you can delete it. Now, the ones in Kevin Holman's folders are going to be read-only, so some of these operations may not actually be available here. And we're not going to touch on this too much, but if you were to select more than one, here I'll select the class and the folder state and alert view proofs. We can delete both of them, or we can combine. So when you create fragments, you'll normally have sort of one element in them. You know, a discovery would also have a class, but fundamentally it's only got one workflow, which is the discovery in it. But you might have, for instance, create a fragment that has monitors, and you want to create alert views in there. This is one way you might be able to do it, to merge two smaller fragments together into a larger one. Like I said, I'm not going to demonstrate that today. It could take a good hour its own session. So let's look at importing fragments. Now, we have a management pack open here, so we'll just use that. There's an import fragment button here. You can also get it here. There's the import fragment choice on the root of the management pack. And I don't think we're going to get a chance to talk about some of these things, but there's some other options here which are available for the entire management pack. You can view or edit the XML of an entire management pack. You can edit references to add or delete or rename some of the things there. You can import a fragment. You can check for missing display names. There shouldn't be any here. Those were created with our wizards, which always add the. You can verify, and this uses the SDK verify, which always complains if unsealed management packs have classes or relationships in them. So this, while it's giving an error, is actually a very normal thing. We have the best practices analyzer. And what that does is it doesn't just look at sort of the syntax of the management pack. It looks at what it actually means and tries to give you some semantics of it. It looks, and I've got some issue here that it really doesn't like. I'm not sure what's wrong there. So I'm going to only have to describe this to you. I'm surprised. This usually works. I don't know what I've done here that's different. But basically it looks through, and for instance it would look at discoveries and how frequently they're being run, and might warn you if you're running a discovery once an hour, which is of course significantly faster than what they would recommend. So it gives you sort of that deep dive. You also have the choices here to seal an MP, deploy an MP to a management group, and there's choices for compare and document. More of these are available in MP Studio. So we'll just leave those for the time being. But let's get on to what we really want, which is import. So I haven't done anything with fragments yet on this machine, so you're seeing this bare. You saw that I had to import or download the fragments from GitHub, so we have the same situation here. I don't have an existing fragment file that I previously used, so I could browse, and that didn't choose the default, which it really should have. Ian, take a note, will you? So really it should have been pointed here if it didn't exist. So this was the structure we were looking at before. We have the folder with Kevin's fragments, my fragments, the Silac fragments, and user submitted ones. So we could select something here. Or we can use the search dialog. And the search dialog is going to look fairly familiar to you. It's like the manage, except it helps you search and select a fragment. So if we want to look for a monitor, and we want a counter monitor, then we can filter this down quickly, and we want a two-state consecutive sample performance counter monitor, and we don't want the script. So we can double-click that, and we've loaded the fragment. Now here at the bottom, we have a preview of what's going to be substituted, what the result is going to look like when we put it in. Now, at the current time, we haven't got any values for any of the parameters, so we show the parameter in here, and that's this string here, the crunch company ID crunch. And you'll see that this occurs in a number of places, and once we have a value, those would be substituted in. And this is, in fact, what a fragment looks like. That it has a header, it's an block of XML, it's got a comment block at the beginning with the description, a version, modified date, a list of the fragments that will be put in, mandatory references so we know what other referenced MPs may need to be there. And then it says that in the management pack, in the monitoring section, under monitors, we will create this new unit monitor. And we will put it in with a name that's got the substitution for the company name and a substitution for the application name, etc., .perf monitor. And it fills in a whole bunch of good stuff here, including alert parameters and string resources and all the rest of this stuff. So all that information is all there, and any values we give will be substituted in here. So as I mentioned, this is the default state. If you right-click here in the preview, you can choose to turn on coloring for the XML, where we'll display different elements in different colors. You know, comments come up in green, attribute names come up in red, the sort of brown is used for element names, text values for attributes are in this blue, this sort of stuff. Some people find this a lot easier to read, others don't like the coloring, they find it confusing. So we'll just leave it as an option for you. The other option that is available, and you'll see it right here on the unit monitor line, is it's set to wrap after the first attribute. So we have one attribute on the line, but if there are further ones, we wrap them. And this tends to make a tall document to look at, but it's not incredibly wide. Some people prefer not to have the attribute wrapping, in which case you'll see that unit monitor, which used to be about 6 lines long, is now 1 line, but of course you have to scroll all the way to the right to see it. This is, again, a personal preference, and it depends on how you've sized the window, because of course you can size this window as big or as small as you want. I'm not going to leave it like that, but and you may have a taller monitor or a wider monitor. Sorry, my throat was dry there. So let's start filling in some of these values. Now I'm going to make this a bit taller so we can see some of the things we're going to substitute in here. In particular, let me just come here and select company ID so we can see where that's going to go in. So let's put in a value here, silent. That's the last time we would need to type that typically, because we'll remember that setting, and every time we come up, every fragment that uses company ID will get a default value now of select filled in. We have the application name, and I'm not going to know what we'll call this, so let's call this box stamper. So in our Canada boxes case, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to mute myself here, I'm choking. Yeah,
so you can choke and still develop management packs using fragments. I love it.
That's the hope. So we have a class ID here. Now here, because this is a monitor we're creating, we need a class that we're going to target. So we have the ability to bring up a browser, and this has a list of all the targets that are available to us, and that's a long list, but by default it shows the first target from our management pack, which is probably what we want. And in this case, it is exactly what I want. We'll just select that. For object name, instance name, counter name, and perhaps frequency, I'm not sure. Those are a triplet. And I just want to show where that is. Oh, by the way, you'll notice here in the unit monitor and the ID, we've already filled in the parameters we know. So this is very much a preview. As we know the values, we'll fill them in. So our configuration here has the counter, object name, whether we're using all instances, and frequency might be part of that. Let me just check. If we click on any one of those, we bring up the browser, which lets us specify all of this information. So we can, of course, browse this computer, or we could go to a different computer if we want to. We can choose, I'm sorry about that. We could choose something else if we wanted to, logical disk, C:, and we want idle time. I'm just choosing random values here, honestly. But once we do that, it fills in the 3 values here and populates the preview with them. So there's fewer things here. We have a threshold here for frequency, how often we're going to collect this data. Again, we have a browser here. 5 minutes is a pretty good choice, but you could change it to anything you want. The next thing we have is a threshold, and this is what we're going to compare it to. And the comparison is greater, so we want to ensure that idle time, if idle time is greater, so this is probably not the best choice here. Let me change this from idle time to sorry, I don't have a particularly good one here. Let's assume this is adequate. Threshold idle time, we'll put in 50 here for 50%. I'm not even sure that's the right thing here. You can't be completely cavalier. And this is how many samples we want to collect to, I think, average them. No, because this is consecutive samples. So we would need this many samples to be over that threshold before you'd raise an alert. And so we'll just put in a value of 3 here, for example. Now that we have values for all the parameters, you'll notice there's no more little red indicators here. The import button is available and we can import this. 2 other buttons I want to talk about here. We do have the download fragment library from GitHub button. So this is just a convenience. It'll go out and it downloaded that zip file again and found that it hadn't been updated since I did it 8 minutes ago. But it means you don't need to use the manage window. You can come in here and just periodically check for updated fragments if you want to. We also have an edit XML button. Now this window here is a preview. You can't actually edit anything here. That's me typing and it won't change anything. But for instance, this example here is checking to see that the idle time is, if it's greater than 50%, that would raise an alert. Well, for idle time, that's probably not true. So before we import it, we do allow you to edit the XML. We'll bring up an XML editor, and in this case, we can change things. I'm just going to quickly change that to less. And I'm going to save that. And if we come down here in the preview again with the value substituted in, you'll now see that we have less here. So we want to ensure that our idle, if it's less than 50% for 3 samples every 5 minutes consecutive, then we would raise an alert. And at this point, we can import. Now, because we were doing monitors, we have this new monitor. And there it is. We've imported it. And if we look at the XML, you'll see that this looks quite familiar to you. This is the stuff that was showing up in the preview. You know, there's our idle time, and there's our less that I had typed in, et cetera, et cetera. It substituted that in there. But it's also put in the alert message. You know, there it is showing there. We have the display name was filled in, and it replaced things appropriately. One thing Ian would kill me if I forgot to mention is, you notice we selected % idle time. That's not a legal name for an element in SCOM. So we look at that and we actually substitute. We replace the underscore, the spaces with underscores, which are legal. The % sign isn't legal, so we replace that with the word % to make a legal name out of it. And we do that automatically for you. So that pretty much describes it. Yeah. Okay. One of the other things we can do, I mean, we could spend an hour going through some of the various fragments. And if I have some time, I'll look at some of them. There are some really good ones in here. What I want to do now is I'll just quickly show you how quickly we could create a second monitor for something related to this. So we come in here, and let's say the only thing we really care to change is go from idle time to disk write time, and import, and it's done. There's a whole monitor that quickly. If that was 10 seconds, I'd be surprised. But of course, what you give up is there's a lot of things you can't change there, or you need to do some XML editing or things like that. You can change some of those over here in the view edit, the properties view edit dialog. I mean, you could, if you wanted to, change alert priorities and alert severity, but you know, for alert severity, for instance, he's used match monitor health, which is the typical thing. Auto resolve typically is set to true. So these are pretty good starting points. Change them if you need to. You could even create a separate version of that fragment where you've made some tweaks if you want to reuse that a number of times. So let's consider creating fragments. Now we have a fairly large library from Kevin. I can't remember the exact count of them. I think it was 44 from Kevin, and there's 2 from us. And hopefully new ones will be coming in from the community. But they may not meet all of your needs. So one of the things you can do is you can edit a fragment. Now, we haven't chosen one, so let's just quickly search here, and we'll look at, actually, let's look at that same monitor that we were looking before, which was performance to state. I guess that was the one. Let's say we actually wanted to change this because we didn't want to generate alerts. And we do that. Sorry, I haven't quite prepped this example, so I'm sort of winging this. I remember exactly what you do to turn off an alert, and I believe it's you remove the entire alert settings here, which is not going to be the best example because it's going to require a little bit more modification than I want to do for a quick test. So let's just say we want to change it so that instead of auto-resolving, we want to make auto-resolve false for some reason. I can come in here and I can edit the XML. You saw me do this earlier, and this is a specific case here. So we have only made that one change, and then we would save. If we try to save now, it's going to give us an error because the file is read-only on the system. So what we would do is we could come up here to My Fragments, save it there, and change the name just so we can find it. No, auto resolve. And when we do that, and we import a fragment again, if we go to search and we look for monitors for counter name, we will see 3 of them now. Remember, we only had the 2 before from Kevin Holman. We've just created this new one, and we've imported that. We normally would have done a bit more editing on that. So let's do that. But you know, it's available that quickly for you. So let's edit that fragment a bit more. I don't have a particularly good thing I want to put in here. Well, let's make this a parameter then. Let's make this auto-resolve a parameter. So we're going to highlight the false there, and we're going to click this button called Add Parameter from Selection. It knows from the tags that are around it that the name you probably want is auto-resolve, and you have the current value of false. Now, we only want to do this in this one place, so I'm going to click this Replace Only One Occurrence, and there we go. So we now have a new parameter called auto-resolve, and it'll need to be filled in. This is from My Fragments, so I can quickly save it. And so now if I go to Import again, and I select monitors with counter name, I can do that. But you'll also note that auto-resolve is now in that list of parameters. So if I click auto-resolve, we get the one thing. If we load it up, it looks very similar to before, but we now have a new parameter called auto-resolve. We've got the red exclamation mark, meaning we need a value for this parameter, and we can set that to true. Now we would change some of the other properties here, because if we try to import this, we're going to get a conflict because we've already got things with the same name. We would have to change to a different counter or something like that. But if we do that, we can import this and it'll work. Now actually that's a bit out of order what I was planning on doing. What I was actually going to do is look at some of these monitors that we created earlier and just show you that you can point to any monitor or any rule or discovery in any management pack, sealed or unsealed, and you can create a fragment from it. And this is useful for doing what Kevin Holman describes as forklifting. That's finding a really good example of a workflow in another management pack, be it sealed or unsealed, regardless of who the vendor is. If you find some logic that you think is particularly good, you can forklift that out and create a fragment. And when we do that, and this won't be as impressive as it could be, we pick up the element that you've selected, in this case this unit monitor, but we would also pick up everything else that this needs. So if this unit monitor had a monitor type that it was using, and that might have other parts, other unit monitors and module types, that sort of thing, it will include all of those into the new fragment. It also picks up string resources that are necessary and all the language strings that are needed to make this work. And so at this point, you have basically a complete copy of that monitor. What we don't have is any parameters there. So this is a case where, well, we do have one parameter. We have the target that is replaced with a class ID. So here we select a parameter, or sorry, a value, and we say let's add a parameter there. And the recent, let's go to all here. And this is company name, right? Select will be replaced with company name. We would have demo. We would probably replace with application name, app name here, etc., etc. This would be something we would also replace with class ID. I think it'll give us a warning here. Yeah, because we have an existing parameter. When we created this fragment, we didn't know all the places we should use that. The only place we knew was in the target field. So we already have this parameter, and we want to put it in other places now. So it just gives us a warning. And now we have it not just in the target here, but we've used it in the identifier, and that'll of course be used throughout the thing. It'll be used as part of the name of the alert setting, etc., etc. I'm just going to continue one more thing here I think I need to do to make this unique. Oops. Actually, I should be able to right-click here and say add parameter from selection. And, oh, we'll go here to this list. So the distinction here, let me just talk. These are parameter names I've recently used. Browsable is a list of all the parameter names that can be used and will display a browser. All is a list of all of the parameter names in all of the fragments that are available on your system. And you'll note that auto resolves there. That's one I created a couple moments ago. But in this case, we want a service name, and so that is browsable. So we'll put that in. That's going to replace spooler, and that's cool. One thing I want to just mention here about these browsable names is the way we determine if it's browsable is if the name is a prefix or a suffix. And event ID is probably a really good one there. We might have a first event ID and a second event ID, or a healthy event ID and a warning event ID. And we can use two different parameter names. As long as they both either start or end with event ID, we will recognize those as a browsable parameter. So you can have multiple browsable items that are completely independent. You just prefix or suffix the name so that it still says event ID. In this case, we only have one service ID. So that's how we can add parameters from selected text. We can also add parameters without selecting text if we want to. We put in the text we want here. I'm not going to demonstrate that. We can rename parameters. We can remove a parameter, and that'll put a value back in if we wanted to. We have the ability to edit the header. You'll notice there's no description here. We're looking at a version, but we do have a last modified date. Now, every time we save a management pack from within our dialogues, we would update this last modified, but we would never change version, and we have no concept of what to fill in for a description. So if I bring up edit header, we can change all of those things, but as I mentioned, we're going to automatically update last modified for you. Okay, fragment to monitor a service based on the MP Studio wizard. So we have our class ID, counter name, app name, and service name. And I'm sure there's other things we might want to parameterize, but we don't have to. So let's save this one to my fragments. And I'm going to give this a specific name. Call this fast service. It's a poor name, but you'll see what I want to do there. So if we import a fragment and we search here for fast service, we have our class ID is already filled in for us. We have our counter name. Oh, this is not a service. Did I save the wrong place or something? Our service name here. I seem to have mixed things up. I don't know whether I did that. I'm not quite sure what I've done wrong here. This is not.
Mike.
What did I do?
You picked counter name when you should have picked company ID.
Oh.
So you can rename that parameter, I guess.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. So there's a great example. Let's edit that fragment. That should be the last one we've got here. So use counter name. We'll select that. We'll rename that parameter to company name, which is on the all list. Company ID. Okay. Save. Import fragment. And so now we have our class ID. We have our company name. We have the app name, but we have to choose a service name now. So I can bring up my service browser and I can choose that BTH service that Paul loves so much. And we can import that. So there created right that quickly a new service monitor for a service. And the reason I called it fast service is I'm going to see how fast I can do this. We'll look for the defrag service and we'll import. And in about 10 seconds, I've created a new service monitor. With lots of experience, I could probably use the wizard and do it in under 30 seconds, but this can be significantly faster. Again, you trade off speed for the amount of flexibility you have. Actually, my little error turned out good there. I got to demonstrate another feature here. Okay, I think we've pretty much touched on that. We've looked at the edit fragment in a lot more detail than I thought we would. The most important thing is to save your own fragments in the My Fragments folder. Do not save them in the Kevin Holman folder, the Silex folder, or even the user submissions. Save them in the My Fragments folder so they won't get clobbered. And if you submit them to us through the community site, and we'll get to sometime soon, we're not quite ready there yet, they may end up being delivered back to you under user submissions and in a folder of your name or your company name as you choose. And then you might want to delete them from My Fragments if we have the latest, that sort of thing. But make sure you don't clobber the existing ones or you'll get clobbered on your own. But the last thing we can do here is, let me just quickly create an alert view. Paul went through this earlier. I don't even have a folder here, so we'll go use the root. And we're going to create alert source of all, and we're going to target that class, and we'll give it the default name here, and we'll finish. So let's say we want this alert view, and we want to put this in. So we want to add to an existing fragment. The existing fragment that we were looking at only does a monitor for a service. But we'd like to enhance that so every time we create that monitor, we also create a view. Now, you wouldn't use an alert view with a monitor, that's fine. This is just an example. So we have the choice there of not just create but add to. I will select the fragment that we want to use, and we load this in. Now, you will see here that we have our monitor, and if I continue to scroll down, here under presentation, we have the view. So we've combined the two together. Now, we didn't do any substitutions here, so here's a place where we would add parameter from selection, and we would select company name or company ID. Yes, we want to use that. And we would you say demo is our app name. And it's going to warn us about that again. I can tell it never to warn me about that again, etc. So with the new parts, I would put in any appropriate substitutions. So we now have combined things together, and I can save that. And we now have a fragment that when we import it, would create a view as well. And of course, you can do that for any fragments. You can add whatever you need in there. So you can create a fragment, for instance, which would, if you had a number of applications which have related monitoring, you could create a fragment that has a discovery for that, for a class for that, a certain set of monitors, a certain set of views that you're going to need for a number of instances of related applications. And then you can very quickly create the monitors for them, or the management packs for them. So how's our time looking here? Actually, we're doing pretty good. I think that pretty much covers all the things I really wanted to demonstrate. I think maybe at this point we could just sort of look at some of the fragments. Let me just review my notes here and see if there's anything I forgot to mention. I think that pretty much covers everything I was thinking of. So let's just briefly look at some of the fragments that Kevin's provided. Apparently there's email coming in.
Yeah, I don't know whose that is or what, but it's very loud.
Yeah, it's my phone, but it's also my tablet, which I will shut up as well.
Thanks, Mike. That's excellent. Good stuff. So we're ahead of schedule here, are we?
Yeah.
I'll take a minute then and invite questions. I know Mike's got something else he's going to move into here shortly, but if there are any questions, I know this is, relatively new. I did share in the handout section of the GoToWebinar applet a document describing what is a fragment for future reference, but any of the documentation that we think you might benefit from, we'll share that available later at some point, probably create a download location and make that available. So, but there are a couple of documents, the opening presentations in there, mostly shared that so you'd have the agenda. And there's the definition document for what is a fragment. There's a question about Linux fragments. Do we have any Linux fragments?
There are. We bring up the search here and we search for Linux. There's one. And I know we've been talking with Kevin about that, and he gets some queries about this, and so I think somewhere down the line he will be producing additional ones. But if we look at this, let's just take a look and see what it does. I'm going to expand this a bit so we see a bit more of the fragment. So this fragment includes a class of discovery for a Unix Linux application based on the existence of a directory and a config file existing. File path is the directory path of your application. Config files such as optmyapp.config. And so we have a company name, an application name, and the path that we have to fill in. We would probably have a different name here because, we probably wouldn't be using our stamper here for Linux, and the app path. And we don't have a browser for that. So a file browser for a Linux machine would be something that we would need to provide with eventual support for Linux, but we really don't have that right now. So this fragment, it defines a class which includes the app name and an install path that it's going to get. It has a data source module type here, which is going to use, it's got the target system, an interval, and an app path that it's going to search. App path is an overridable parameter here. And so here's what the thing actually does. It's actually going to use this Unix class discovery shell data source which will run on the target system and executes this command, ls, the path, and then as a word count, I think that's minus L, which I don't remember exactly what that does. But the idea here is to find out whether there are any files there, in which case it exists, and so it would return a true and create the thing. This has a 120-second timeout, etc. And then the mapper maps the standard output. That's some magic syntax there, but it basically is looking at standard output is equal to a value of 1. And so what the word count minus L did is maybe that's number of lines. It's been a while since I've worked on that. So it's probably trying to prove that there is one line, which means that that path exists. If this expression is true, then it would create this class for us, and it'll put in the app name from what we've already specified. The install path is the app path that was specified. Display name is the target system name, and a principal name. And we have the actual discovery, and you can look at that if you want. Basically, it's going to run the scheduler, and every periodic time it's going to execute this probe action, which is going to execute the command on the script. And then there's another probe action down here, and it gets horribly complicated, but eventually it is going to execute this, which is a Microsoft Unix WSMan invoke probe action on the target system. And I'm not even sure what that URI is. I've never looked at this. I have no idea how that actually works. I have to look at that. And then we have our discovery that we finally create. We pass the app path through, and the language strings and that sort of information. So that's probably more detail than you wanted or cared.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah. Anything else on the questions?
No. Was there something else you wanted to cover on this topic?
Well, I thought we could look at what is available here.
Yeah, let's do that. Browse through it. And while Mike is doing that, if you guys on the call today have some ideas of some fragments you would like to see, you think you might use, we're definitely interested in finding out about it. You know, we could collaborate. If you're working on something but you're just looking for a little help to get it over the edge, you know, we'd be interested in helping you with it as well. So if you have suggestions, you can send those in the chat window or the questions here. And Mike, something else to think about. I realize you've been talking quite a bit today. If you want, I could do my session on MP Studio. If you wanted to take a break, I could do that next, but totally up to you. If you wanted to finish up, do the SNMP half hour, and then you're done for the day. So it's
yeah, I think I'll do that. Okay. I don't know why I had that little coughing fit there earlier, but it seems gone. I'll just need 2 or 3 minutes between sessions, and then I'll be ready to go again.
Okay.
So here's a look at some of the fragments that are there. Kevin's got some really good support for registry discovery based on key exists or PowerShell script or value exists or the expression matches. He has a PowerShell discovery script and a VB script. Now, for what it's worth, anything that's got script is probably got a big hole in the middle that you need to fill in. And sorry, let me just look down here. You'll see that this fragment defines a class, and it has a discovery, but it also has a script in it. And the script has some information here on how to test this. And this is a good example. If you want to test one of these outside of SCOM, you can define a couple of things here, and he's got them commented out, and then the script would tend to run. He's got a good thing here where he's got a name for the script, and he does some logging here, mom API log script event, so that you know what is happening. And then he has this line here, begin main script. And this is where you have to figure out what it is you want to discover. And this would be different in each case. So in this case, he's looking for a folder, and he's looking for paths underneath there, and he is going to go through that and use that and fill in paths and stuff like that. Otherwise, he logs an event, and then he returns the discovery bag. Here, wish he hadn't called it debag. And then he actually just logs another event which says that the script has come to an end. So he's got a very good
I knew you couldn't resist that, Mike.
But anything with a script, you're going to find a big chunk in the middle that you need to replace. And you can use the edit XML command and go in here and actually do your editing. I will just show that you can actually change things in here. We'll just change this from equal to not equal. We could save that. I have no intention of saving it. No, I don't want to save the edits. So there's that. So he's got a lot for discovery. He has some group stuff here, group instances and group instances with roll-up. I haven't looked at these. This fragment would create group of instances, your custom class with help roll up to the group object, which you may find very useful. You can do that in MP Author, MP Studio by creating a group class and then creating a dependency roll-up or an aggregate roll-up, depending on which one he's actually used there, if you need to. Groups of Windows computers and watchers. The folder state and perf views is one that he uses basically to add in those views. Monitors for performance counters, processes, registries. Interestingly, monitors for registry values. It's not something I would typically imagine you doing, but the registry does contain a lot of dynamic data as well as static data, so certainly there will be cases where you want to do that. Service monitors with no alert, ignore disabled services with alert, with a recovery, so that addresses some of the issues that Paul was showing earlier today. He has a monitor that pulls an SNMP device for an OID value, but it's limited to integer, and honestly for the SNMP stuff, because of what you can do there, you're probably much better going through the wizards I'll be showing in the very next session. So script monitor for PowerShell and VB script, and again you have to put your stuff in here. Oh, here's a Unix shell command monitor, and that probably is perfectly good for Linux as well. Monitors, rules for alert generating events, SNMP traps, and again I would suggest that you're probably better off using the wizards for that. It's more alerts and tasks. But you can look at those fairly quickly. You can hover over them to see the full descriptions. You can load them in to read them up, read them over to see what they're going to do for you. All of those things are available to you. Well, there's an interesting comment in the questions. Would like to see a Linux fragment for file system type, EX, ext2, etc. When you get it done, we'll be glad to put it up on GitHub for you. It does sound useful. I don't know we'd get around to it, but that does seem like a useful one. So at this point, I'm going to pretty much quit for 2 minutes and come back and do my SNMP talk. Right. Is there any other questions that need to be addressed?
Well, Ian wants to know who developed this great or designed this great feature. Okay, Laurie, to your question, if there's another Linux MP out there, you can load that in MP Author Professional or MP Studio and use the forklift procedure. So if there's something in there that's doing something very similar, that would be a starting point for you. But certainly if this is something you're investing time in, if it's going to be very useful for you, we should talk and maybe we could work together to build this, and then make it available in the community. So we will reach out to you if I don't hear from you, because I'd like to know more about what you're trying to do with that MP and how important that is to you. So I do not see any other questions. We have 2 more sessions coming today. And there was a question about documentation and making that available. This afternoon we did manage to get this GoToWebinar application, which does allow us to share some documents. However, we're not quite yet prepared to distribute those amongst the attendees. Hopefully by the end of the week we'll have, that all set up. So we just need to do a little sanitizing of the documents, and we'll make those available for everyone afterwards, including the PowerPoint presentations. So the remaining 2 sessions today include Mike's session. He's got a half-hour session on authoring SNMP based management packs. So SNMP was, one of the biggest, most popular requests we had to extend the authoring experience. Lots of people wanted Linux stuff too, but it's really been difficult to put that into the tool. So we are able to do quite a bit with SNMP. Mike is going to show you all of those things. And then for the closing session, I will present on extending your authoring experience using some of the features in MP Studio. So, there's much more to authoring than just creating the rules, monitors, discoveries, and making a management pack that works. And all of the authoring features you've seen today are available in MP Studio. And so, I would recommend you have at least one license of MP Studio because it's got the database backend, and as I'll show you in the final session. Because of that, there's lots of cool things you can do. For example, having a simple backup, but you can also do a lot more. Auditing management packs, comparing management packs, creating overrides, testing management packs, deploying management packs centrally, from the store database, and then documentation. People purchase MP Studio just for the documentation capabilities, but all of these features can be leveraged to build some best practices and repeatable process around your authoring experience. I'll share that with you at 3 o'clock once Mike's done with the SNMP stuff. So please hang on. 2 more